I've mentioned before that change is inevitable on construction projects, and one of the most important areas in which that's true is the site conditions. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how site conditions can differ and how most contracts address that situation. When we're talking about differing site conditions, what we're talking about usually is subsurface conditions. For example, somebody thinks that the owner thinks that based on a geotechnical survey that it's done on the front end of the, before the design's even done, that bedrock is X number of feet down and it's dirt from here to bedrock. And it turns out that in fact, it's not dirt all the way down to bedrock, that there's something there. It may be other kinds of rock, it may be water table, it may be toxic waste, any number of things that are under the surface that are different from what folks thought was there for one reason or another. And so understanding that you don't really know what you're getting into until you start actually digging in the ground, construction contracts generally have what are known as differing site conditions clauses, or DSC clauses. And there are two different types of differing site conditions that the clauses are designed to capture. And you'll see in the case law references to a type 1 differing site condition versus a type 2 differing site condition. Now, type 1 differing site conditions are essentially site conditions that are different from what's set forth in the contract documents. So, for example, the architect will have prepared plans and specifications, often on the basis or with the help of having a geotechnical report that the owner had commissioned as a reference point, and the architect will show footings at a certain depth, caissons being drilled down to bedrock, whatever the case may be, the stuff that is built below the surface of the ground. And those plans and specifications are representations by the owner to the contractor that this is what's below the ground. And as we saw before, the owner makes certain representations, both implicitly and explicitly. Implicitly, we talked about the Spearn doctrine and the implied warranty as to the adequacy of the plans and specifications. The contract documents themselves will have certain representations. They may be pictorial, they may be verbal, but representations nonetheless as to what the contractor is likely to get into. Well, when it starts digging below the surface, when those representations or warranties turn out not to be true, we've got what's called a type 1 differing site condition situation, and we'll see how the AIA documents address that in a minute. The second type of differing site condition situation is a type 2, and that's essentially capturing the common law idea of mutual mistake. That is, that the site conditions are different from what anyone would reasonably have expected. Both parties are mistaken about what is underneath the surface. It's not that the owners represented that something is the case and it turns out not to be. It's that nobody knew that there was toxic waste underneath the surface, and no one had any reason to know. So we'll see the language too that the AIA documents have that address the type 2 site conditions. But it's important to understand the type 1 really captures where there's been some sort of breach of a duty of accuracy by the owner in what it's told the contractor about what's underneath the surface. Type 2 has not so much the concept of breach of a duty by the owner, but simply mutual mistake. Both parties were mistaken about what's under the surface. It's important to understand that these two types of site conditions and the clauses and the remedies that are triggered when you've got one of those are cumulative of other kinds of remedies, for example, commercial impracticability or impossibility or frustration of purpose, things like that that have been developed in the case law. What's an advantage to these contractual remedies is that they're easier to prove, because they simply say that, for example, misrepresentation by the owner triggers a remedy by the contractor without the contractor having to prove intent to deceive or negligence or anything like that. So in that sense, they're easier to prove. The AIA A201 deals with differing site conditions in section 3.7.4. And you can see in this language quoted in the slide, basically both type 1 and type 2 differing site conditions addressed. If the contractor encounters conditions at the site that are 1, subsurface or otherwise physical conditions that differ materially from those indicated in the contract documents, okay, that's type 1. The conditions are different from what the plans, for example, showed the subsurface conditions were going to be. So if the contractor encounters a type 1 situation, or 2, unknown physical conditions of an unusual nature that differ materially from those ordinarily found to exist, etc., that's type 2, the mutual mistake scenario. So where the contractor all of a sudden turns up an ancient burial site, for example, that nobody had any reason to know was there. That would be a type 2 situation, and that's captured in this 374 subsection 2 language. So 374 at the beginning just lays out the two different types, type 1 and type 2. Okay, if the contractor encounters either a type 1 or type 2 differing site condition, then the contractor has to do certain things in order to have any sort of relief. Has to notify the owner and the architect. Architect does an investigation, and if the architect agrees that the discovery of the burial site or discovery of the rock that nobody knew was there will materially differ from what was in the contract documents that the contractor based its bid on, and increases the contractor's time or cost, then the architect is to recommend a change to the contract sum or contract time or both, and those would be, if everybody agrees, those would be embodied in a change order. If everybody doesn't agree, as we've talked before about the impact of the changed conditions, then we might have a construction change directive, and it would be left for the parties to try to work toward an agreement to address the impact on the contractor's schedule or cost. But it would become part of the change process. For our purposes here, the important point is that the differing site conditions fall into these two broad categories and trigger certain remedies on part of the contract. So, differing site conditions are very common, and it's one huge area of risk that's expressly addressed in the AIA documents. And this is important because it varies from the common law, right? Because under the common law, essentially, all the risk is on the contractor. If a contractor agrees to build a project for X number of dollars, it's obligated to build the project. And if that means that it has to spend time excavating an ancient burial site in order to get all the artifacts out and preserved and whatnot, and that adds another couple of months to the contract time under the common law, that would be the contractor's problem. What the differing site conditions provisions do is alter that common law rule so that under certain circumstances, if you've got a type 1 or a type 2 differing site condition, then the contractor has some contractual entitlement to relief if the differing condition will have an impact on its time or cost.